I think that Biden realized that his.
Good morning, everyone. This is a Howard County delegation meeting. We've got a few guests still joining us from the waiting room. We are discussing today HOCO 1021 and the amendment which was offered at our last meeting with just, which was a very short meeting. So we had a chance to let the sponsor sort of present the amendment, but did not really get into full discussion of it. Based on a few questions that came up during last week's meeting and a few questions from members that were forwarded as follow-up, we did reach out to both our police department and our school system. And I want to thank Chief Myers and Superintendent Martirano for being with us to address those questions. Members, there were some preliminary written responses which you received by email yesterday evening. I know folks may or may not have had a chance to fully review and digest those since they came in just yesterday evening. But I'm going to start asking Chief Myers if you could please walk us through the responses you provided, and please feel free to. I think the overarching question about the amendment is, how do you think this would work? What what seems workable to you? What concerns do you have? How would, if the delegation chooses to go this route with the amendment that was offered, what is your feedback? What would the implications be from your perspective? And, open to whatever feedback or suggestions you have related to that.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for having me on this morning. I definitely know the importance of this subject. I think that there needs to be a lot more discussion surrounding the proposal of community resource officers. So up until this point, I have not had an opportunity to have discussion with Dr. Martirano or any of the legislators who are proposing this amendment. So having these community resource officers, we need to kind of delve in a little bit more what that role would be, whether or not it would be a position that lives under the police department or if it lives under the school system. One of the concerns about having community resource officers plays into how we deploy our personnel. So while we may have officers who would be dedicated as community resource officers, there is always a possibility that officer could be on a call for service and tied up and not available to respond to a school in an emergency situation. In that type of situation, a patrol officer would be the first on the scene. With community resource officers, even if that officer is available and a call comes out, in most instances, a patrol officer would be closest to a school, which means that patrol officer may not have a familiarity with the layout of a school, may not be familiar with the students or the administrators. And that lack of familiarity with the layout of a building could hamper an officer's response to an emergency situation for something like a fight or some major disruption that causes some concern for security of our students in the school. I think that we really need to have, my major concern is having more discussion about the policies behind this. So, basically what I'm getting from, if I understand what this community resource officer position would be, we're looking at taking SROs out of the school, physically inside of the building, and just having them roam around in the community until there's a call for service. So we really need to go back to the fundamental question of how our SROs perform in the schools. I think that we have a very strong framework for our SRO program, and I would think that what would be most beneficial is to be able to look at that existing framework and to try to improve upon that framework. I know there was some questions raised about grant funding. I think that there are a lot of misinformation out there about the school resource officer program. In Howard County, our SROs are not grant funded. They are covered through the police department's budget. If we were to remove SROs from the school, it would be zero cost savings. If anything, I think that removing SROs from the school would actually be a significant increase for the school system's budget to be able to hire private security or counselors, or whatever positions would be used in the absence of having SROs. Again, it would need to be more discussion about private security and how they are trained and what the oversight is for those entities working within the schools. So with that, I'd like to open up if anyone has any questions for me.
Delegate Novotny has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chief Myers, so there's been a lot of discussion also about the fact that, let's just talk about the basics of the program, that there is a school to prison pipeline that has been created by the SRO program. So in a generic year, can you talk about individual arrests, kind of what that entailed, what is the severity of that, talk about the victims involved, and then also how many times an actual SRO might actually make an arrest versus what they do on a day-to-day basis, which obviously we've talked about the benefits of having them there.
Sure. So our SROs are interacting with students thousands of times throughout the course of a month, throughout the course of a year. Their purpose is twofold in terms of building strong relationships with the students and providing that security presence. Arrests are a last option, and that is usually after our SROs have consulted with school administration and that there are no other school-related sanctions that would be more appropriate to handle. Usually when we are making arrests in schools, it is for situations where students are
rename down, rename.
Usually when we are making arrests in the schools, it is for situations where there is a major disruption to the safety of the school environment. If there is some kind of physical attack on a student or a teacher, or if it's something that may be drug related. During the course of the year, we make a minimal number of arrests. In most instances, issues are able to be resolved through a non-disciplinary way. Even in those times when we are making arrests in the schools, probably about 80% of those arrests are handled in a diversion way or in a restorative justice model. Last year alone, well, actually the 2019-2020 school year, all arrests that were made in the Howard County school system were handled by diversion through a restorative justice programs.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chief.
All right, and next question from Delegate Watson.
Yes, thank you, Chief, for being with us this morning. I have two related questions. You said that now we have a minimal number of arrests and we try to take the kids through other programs instead. And if we were to move to this suggested model, I guess what I'm wondering is if we have an SRO on premise who's familiar with the school and the students versus a random beat cop respond to an incident, would we be more likely to have more arrests in the situation where we had beat cops responding versus someone who understood the situation as an SRO within the school?
So I would believe we would have more arrest with our beat officers responding, only because those officers will not be familiar with the students, and sometimes with the administrators. Many times our SROs, because we layer our program with other mentoring programs, or students are stopping in the morning just to have conversation with the SROs, they often know those students. So based on those relationships, in many instances, they are able to go in and de-escalate a situation before it even turns into a situation where we would have to take official action against a student. So I think that that established relationship is hugely beneficial.
And in terms of response time, we would be sacrificing the amount of time it takes for a police officer to respond to the school if we go ahead with this amendment.
Absolutely. So in our current model, we have SROs that are assigned in the school for immediate response. In this model, with our patrol officers, there will be some delay. Even if we have an officer that is nearby a school, they still need time to get into the school and you navigate their way through a building. So there could be some significant delay in getting to an emergency incident in the school. And oftentimes, you know, when we talk about emergency incidents in the school, sometimes those emergency incidents could be of a medical nature. Oftentimes, police departments arrive before the fire department arrives.
Thank you, Chief Myers. Colleagues, I don't know how we can proceed with this amendment based on police chief's responses on the basic safety of our schools and our students. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And our next question is from Delegate Atterbury.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So it was my understanding from the data that I received that 17 of the arrests were for disruption and 45% of arrests were for fights without weapons, and not necessarily everyone that was arrested attended a diversion program. So I would like if just Monisha or Erica could respond to the comments earlier about the school to prison pipeline, and also if you could touch on paper arrests, because something that sticks in my head, we just had in the Judiciary Committee a bill related to reforming the juvenile justice system, and a woman came and spoke about her son's interaction with the juvenile justice system for a minor infraction, a very minor offense. He was 10. He ended up spending 3 years in the system where he was not home. So if Monisha, you could touch on that, if I could get your opinion on that.
Sure, I'm happy to speak to those points and the other comments made. You're absolutely right that actually a majority of the arrests in Howard County Public Schools, in the most recent data we have from the State Department of Education, were for fights without weapons and disruption. So around 65% total. So kids are being arrested for, typical childhood behaviors. These are not school shootings. These are not behaviors that are, threatening the fundamental safety of the school district. They are run-of-the-mill fights, and they are disruption, right? As for, and every one of these arrests brings students into the juvenile system. They've got to show up for meetings. They're missing school. Parents are missing work. They may be put on probation. One of the conditions for probation is typically that they not miss school, but we often see suspensions and sort of a pulling back from school because of the trauma associated with the arrest or because the student has otherwise been pushed out. So then they don't meet their conditions of probation and often then do end up at real risk for long-term detention. All of these arrests do end up in their records. Juvenile records can be expunged, but if you get in trouble in any other way, it increases either as a juvenile or as an adult, no matter how minor. Again, you can be arrested, and you are arrested for disruption, right, or disorderly conduct. Then that amplifies the criminal consequences. Again, making detention, incarceration a real risk. Also, in the immediate sense, gives you a record that you've got to report to colleges, that you've got to report to employers. So we are at the get-go, at the point of these arrests, pulling students out of school, pulling parents out of work, forcing them to navigate a legal system, putting them at risk for detention and incarceration, giving them a record that impacts their college and career. And it doesn't matter whether these arrests are with handcuffs or in paper form. That is what happens with every single arrest. And by the way, if you're over 18, then right away you're treated as an adult, no matter whether the arrest happened in school or not, or regardless of what it was for. In terms of the question about sort of the physical layout of the school and the impact and whether arrests would actually well, let me just speak to that. So there's nothing in the amended version of the bill that would prohibit community resource officers from coordinating with the school, to tour the school, to engage in emergency planning before students are actually there, right? You could do that at the beginning of the year. You could do that on breaks. You could maintain a line of communication with administration in the school, so long as you're not there and thereby arresting kids for those run-of-the-mill behaviors that are better addressed through other interventions. As for the question of whether arrests would increase as a result of pulling SROs out, that's not what we've seen in the districts that have done it. There's a school district, intermediate school district right outside the Twin Cities in Minneapolis. They removed all their SROs in 2016. And by the way, this is a school district that has a disproportionately high number of low-income students and students with social emotional disabilities, including autism. They saw their arrests drop from 65 per year to 5 per year when they pulled out their SROs, because you did not have police officers responding to those run-of-the-mill behaviors. Likewise, when Toronto Public Schools, the largest school district in the country, pulled out its SROs in 2017, you saw declines in police involvement in disciplinary action and arrests. You saw declines in suspension rates, expulsion rates, and so forth. So absolutely, we should expect declines in arrests, not the opposite. And the reality is, our police in the community interact with youth in the community all the time, right? They're out in the neighborhoods. They're engaging with young people who are walking around. If they should have that training to engage with youth wherever they are, right? It's sort of a disturbing defense of the SRO program to suggest that we need this program because as a general matter, our officers lack the training to work with young people, because they are expected to do so outside of schools as well.
Okay, our next question is from Senator Hester.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question for Chief Myers. Thank you so much for being here today. It's actually a two-part question, so if you could answer both parts, I'd really appreciate it. The first is that I understand the school is currently going through a process to consider removing SROs from schools. And I'll just read you what I had from the school system was option 1, completely remove school resource officers and replace those with a complement of alternative education teachers, social workers and counselors and security assistants. This option would require a total of 58 FTEs to replace the current complement of SROs and would cost $4.1 million. Option 2, I understand, and I'm reading from the letter, develop a plan that retains the SROs with changes to the program and add a smaller complement of new alternative education teachers, social workers, and counselors. Changes to the SRO program would include a revised MOU currently under development and enhanced training. This option would require a total of 22 FTEs to complement the current SRO program and cost $2.2 million. So here is the question. I mean, these both seem like well thought through like options that are moving forward. The first question is, could you articulate how you would work with the school system in either one of those situations and how long it would take? The second question is that we've received a letter of opposition to this bill from the Howard County NAACP. And I'm wondering if you would be open to including them like in this process and how, what their opinion would be included as we move forward.
So in regards to the cost for some of those proposals, I think Dr. Martorano would probably be the most appropriate to address those. I would be certainly open to sitting down with the NAACP, with Dr. Martorano, and all interested parties to talk about how we look at the SRO program and how do we make it better so that it works for anyone that has any issues or concerns. To this point, I have not been a part of the discussion in terms of those proposals moving forward. So I think that it would be beneficial before we move forward to really sit down and have more discussion to talk about where this funding comes from, how these officers are trained, how is the coordination between police and the school system? Because at the end of the day, you can hire unarmed security and get additional counselors, but there still will be times when police response is needed. So we will need to have some more in-depth discussion before we move forward. I am just concerned that we are taking kind of this national perspective and just trying to apply it to what is happening in our county, and it will not be a seamless transition.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chief Myers. I mean, colleagues, given what we have just heard about the time and the discussions that need to take place, I would like to make a motion to hold this bill to allow the Chief Myers and Dr. Martorano, both parties, including the NAACP, to really work this out. So I motion to hold the bill.
Second.
Okay, so just to clarify the motion, you're asking to cut off today's discussion to allow for further discussion? Am I understanding correctly?
Yes, because I just don't see how we can possibly, Chief Myers and Dr. Martorano have not yet talked. I don't see how we can make an informed decision on the amendment or on the bill without the conversation taking place. And I'm very concerned about this letter from the NAACP opposing the bill. So I think all parties need to be brought to the table to have this discussion. So I move to hold the bill and stop this discussion.
Madam Chair, can I jump in real quick? Just
Sure.
clarify,
Sure.
help. I hope to clarify. Has been our courtesy for a long time is we allow members to hold a bill for a week. And so I don't know that it actually requires a motion per se, but
Well, and
to continue to extend courtesy. That would be my opinion from being around the world.
so I guess that was part of my question in clarifying this motion, because we typically do allow members to hold a bill as a matter of courtesy. So I wasn't sure if by making the motion, if you were attempting to end our discussion today.
That is the motion on the table, yes.
Can I ask a question about the motion?
Yes, Delegate Tarasa.
My understanding of the motion is that we are specifically asking Chief Myers and Dr. Martirano to then go work with the Howard County NAACP and have a discussion of this. And I wanted to have a discussion of that, the NAACP opinion of that. And I think we should continue at least have that discussion. I understand that it's a courtesy to hold a bill, although I think there's already a motion on the table to vote. So, but I don't think we can, I don't think we've had a discussion about what we agree should be happening. Holding a bill is a different thing than sending a directive from the delegation on what should be happening.
Right.
And
Right.
the motion to hold the
Um,
bill is not debatable, for the record.
But her motion was
So-
not to hold the bill. It was to hold the bill with a direction on what should happen while we hold the bill.
I'm
you asked to
sorry,
make a motion.
I'm kind of new to this. My action was to hold, my motion was to hold the bill. I do think we need additional discussion for sure. I mean, I certainly do not feel comfortable on voting the amendment or voting the bill, given that conversations have not happened. We're
So
talking-
let me ask this question of the maker of the motion. We have invited the police chief and our school superintendent to be here this morning. We have a bit more time to hear from them and ask questions, with recognition that the courtesy of holding the bill would be extended to you at the end of the meeting. Would you be willing to withdraw your motion to allow this discussion today to continue?
I guess we've got 15 minutes, but I wouldn't want to withdraw my motion and then have another motion made.
Okay, so you're not willing to practice our common courtesy of allowing members to hold a bill without a motion and a vote?
I'm sorry, I'm rather confused at this point.
Okay.
As you know, I'm relatively new to the Senate.
Mhm. Are you comfortable letting
How about this as a compromise? Why don't we, motion to hold the bill till next week and then continue discussion?
Sure,
Pardon?
sure.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Sure, although I will say, for the benefit of other members, although we're near the end of our time in this session, I do hope that this is not a shift in protocol, that we're no longer going to extend that courtesy and instead rely on a motion and vote. I do think that's an important piece. But at this point, Abby, can you please call the vote on holding this bill at the end of the meeting, allowing our discussion this morning to continue?
Sure. Senator Lamb,
Yes.
Senator Gazzoni, Senator Gazzoni,
Yeah, look, for decades, this delegation has been able to work through things in a cooperative, in a thoughtful, in a respectful way to one another. I don't want to get caught up in all this. I guess I'm voting yes on this, but let's just continue to do what we've been doing. Be thoughtful to one another, give people the time to deal with things that they need to work through. This is a hard issue. And there are hard things that we've got to talk through to get through on this thing. And it's very important. I'm yes, but I really hope that we can get to just a very simple place of just working together without getting too bogged down in process issues. So it's how we always used to be, and I would love to see that. Yes.
Senator Hester,
In explaining my vote, I would just like to say that I am trying to be thoughtful and considerate, and I want all stakeholders to be at the table. I want to allow time for the school system to discuss this with the Howard County Police, and I'd like the NAACP to be involved. And that is why I am making the motion to hold the bill, which we granted to the sponsor of the bill several weeks ago. I really thought these conversations, were going to take place. So I'm trying to be, constructive and thoughtful. And that is why my vote is a yes.
Delegate Feldmark,
Yes.
Delegate Atterbury,
Well, to explain my vote, this bill has been being held every week since session started and since we started our meetings. I'm not sure if everyone has been following along, but the NAACP has been involved since the beginning. The state NAACP in July joined a coalition of 90 other state organizations calling for the removal of SROs. That's the Maryland State NAACP and the Maryland NAACP Legal Defense Fund. The head of the Howard County NAACP in July testified at the Police Reform and Accountability Work Group, which I chaired, to remove the SROs from the schools. And at our local public hearing, no one testified against this legislation. In support of the legislation was the African American Community Roundtable, the African American Coalition of Howard County. And so if the directive is to ask that all of the stakeholders come to the table, then it should absolutely include the African American Community Roundtable and the African American Coalition of Howard County. And so I think I'm looking at the members of the delegation as the only African American mother in our body, I am going to vote no.
Delegate Eversole,
I want to clarify the motion if I could before I vote, please. Is this a motion to hold this bill for 1 week, or is this a motion to hold this bill during this session?
It's the same motion that we voted on other times, is to vote to hold the bill 1 more week.
1 week. Well, I don't know. I can't imagine what's going to change between this week and next week on this. We can certainly give it a week, but I think we'll have a similar picture in front of us. But I will vote yes to hold it a week.
Delegate Hill,
Okay, since we're all explaining things. I think that we're having a process issue with this motion as opposed to simply holding the bill without a vote. And I think that's the problem that I'm having with the bill. I think the bill is well-intended, but the process and steps to achieve the goal were too abrupt. And I had hoped that the amendment that Delegate Atterbury, Delegate Eversole, and Senator Gazzoni have put great time into would have fixed it, and it has not. And so I'm not sure if a week makes a difference. I don't want to stop the discussion and the effort to try and figure out an appropriate way to deal with the issues that are of such concern to our community and our students. I'm interested in discussing what we can do with the letter, but that we can get to later. So I'm going to vote yes for holding the bill. I would, again, hope that we can get back to holding bills without taking votes, and that just being a courtesy to hold a bill at the end of the discussion of the day going forward.
to clarify, that's a yes vote, correct?
Yes, that's a yes vote. Thank you.
Thank you. Delegate Kittleman,
You need to unmute.
Been so long. Since I haven't had a chance to talk, I do have a request for next week, and I will vote yes on this motion. And I'd like to explain what I would like to see happen if I can. There has been a very different description of the arrests that have occurred in our schools between Where is the,
Delegate Kittleman, you are coming up on the list to be recognized. So if
but I'm not going to have time and I want to get this done. The difference between what the one woman said, and I'm sorry, I can't remember her name, and what the chief said. And I was wondering if there was a way for us to get, say, over the last year or 2 years, some form of description that's public that shows us exactly what the charges were for the arrest. Now, I don't know if that's, if possible, but if it is, it would certainly help.
Okay, Delegate Kittleman, I believe your vote was yes. Is that correct?
Can I get that for next week?
We're voting right now. Was your vote yes?
Can I get that for next week? I would like to have an answer. That's not too much to
This
ask.
is not the appropriate time to ask that question. Voting. You can explain your vote. Others have done that. We will follow up with you when we finish this vote. Was your vote a yes?
Yes, it was.
Thank you.
Delegate Novotny,
Yes.
Delegate Pendergrass,
I was planning to say something, but I will just say that I'd like to thank Delegate Hill for sounding like the chair of the Health and Government Operations Committee in her comments, and I'm voting yes.
Delegate Tarasa,
Yeah, to explain my vote, I'm concerned that this bill's been held so many times, I can't even remember who's held it the various weeks. I'm concerned, I don't know why there hasn't been a discussion between Chief Myers and Dr. Margarano and whoever has worked on this particular piece of this amendment. I think a little bit longer of a discussion, like if we started this earlier today, might have helped. I had a number of questions which aren't going to be able to be answered, but I'm just concerned about this. I would have been fine with us just granting this, but if we're going to vote on it, my vote is no.
Delegate Watson,
I think that this is an incredibly important issue. I respect greatly our chief of police, and who is also a Black mother, and who is telling us that this bill, as it is written right now with the amendment, would put all children in more danger. So there is no way that I could support moving forward on this bill as written. And I hope that the sponsor of the bill and the sponsor of the amendment takes the time to speak with Chief Myers and all of the interested parties if they want to fix the bill so it can move forward. So my vote on the motion to hold this bill is yes.
with 3 senators voting yes and 7 delegates voting yes, the motion passes.
Okay, we're picking up our discussion, and the next question is from Delegate Tarasa.
So thank you, Madam Chair. I'm trying to remember where try to figure out. I did have questions along the lines of Delegate Kittleman in terms of the numbers. I know you said that, Chief Myers, that the arrests have been minimal, and I guess we've probably received those, but I would like to see those numbers again in terms of that. And then you said, I think you said 80% have ended up in diversion programs. Just really quickly on that, because I wanted to talk about CROs. The ones that ended up in diversion programs but they still have an arrest involved, either paper arrest or otherwise. Do they still have arrests?
So with the diversion programs, those records do not go to the juvenile justice system.
Okay, but they're technically arrested?
They're technically arrest, yes, but they're handled in a diversionary way.
Yeah, and I do think that your diversion program is a very good one, and I know that I've heard a lot about it through my years. Anyway, on the CRO program, my understanding and talking to the sponsor of the amendment, and I don't want to speak for him, but at least my understanding of it, which made me more comfortable with it, and I'm sorry there hasn't been discussion between you and that sponsor, or you, and I'm happy to talk to you about it as well, was that, and I I'm not sure if he meant or the idea of CROs was exactly what you think of as CROs, because I think CROs are wonderful partners in the community, but was to have the CROs to familiarize themselves with the schools to do. I know when we were working on, and I can't remember you, I know you were there, but I don't know what your role was there. When we were working on Dasher Green Elementary School and Lake Elkhorn Middle, I know one of the things the beat officer or whoever was stationed in the area did was stop by the school every day and just say, hello, how's it going? And familiarize themselves with the principals. And sometimes they got to know the students. And I wonder if that is something that you've given any thought to, if that's just not called CRO, if maybe the term is incorrect, but if that is, I just wanted you to give that some thought, and maybe it's more of a comment, and if you have a comment back, but the idea of having somebody in the community that is familiar with the school, I think was important from my perspective.
So, so one, our SROs, we use them in that very capacity to be familiar with the schools, to develop relationships, to be there on a regular basis. For any of you, I've been in the county for 30 years. If you've worked with me, you know I am willing to sit down and talk about and work through and find a middle ground on almost any topic that you bring forward. My difficulty in this situation is because I have not been included in discussion, it's really hard for me to comment on some of these things.
Okay.
Not that I wouldn't be willing to work, but we really need to sit down and talk about things. In the police department, we use the term CRO in a different capacity. Yes. So it would really require a lot of changes to how we deploy and do business. And at the end of the day, I can't help but go back to, if we were able to sit down and have a discussion, I think that we could work through any concerns with our existing program, you know, and I think it is really important just for me to add that while we see things in many jurisdictions regarding school resource officer programs, I don't have the luxury to just focus on these generalized things that are kind of happening in many jurisdictions. My job is to focus on our jurisdiction and what we see here and what helps to keep our students the safest. So I am just concerned that we're talking about very generalized terms about school resource officers contributing to the school to prison pipeline, when that is just not factual about how we operate our program. But with that being said, I can provide information to all of you on the nature of arrest to give you some idea, but I can assure you, in those instances when we make arrests, they are not for run-of-the-mill situations in a school. They are for serious situations. And I will tell you, as a police officer, we respond to many serious fights that don't involve weapons, where people are severely injured.
Thank you. Okay, we do have only a few minutes left, but I do want to turn to our superintendent, who has been patiently waiting and is a critical piece of this conversation. Dr. Martirano, if you can briefly give us your feedback on the amendment, and given the conversation you've heard, I hope you're willing to engage in that additional conversation that needs to occur really jointly with both the school system and the police department. But if you can please give us your thoughts at this point.
Good morning, delegation, and Delegate Feldmark. I think the operative word was briefly. I will surely do my best here in this short period of time, because I'm going to go back to Delegate Watson and her comments. This is an extremely important conversation, and I would avail myself for further discussion without the time constraints, if that helps in any way. I want to acknowledge Chief Myers and the cooperative relationship of which we have. We have been talking all throughout the process about SROs. We have not had the specific time designated to talk about this amendment. But I'm going to try to use my time wisely and recognize our two board members, Ms. Mallow and Ms. Catronio, who are on as well. I want to remind the delegation that before the Board of Education is the April 29th date, where I will be making a recommendation to the board about the two options that Senator Hester defined in the information we shared with the delegation, which the two options are: one, to prepare for the option one, which would be the removal of SROs, school resource officers. And the second option on the table would be the continuation of SROs with modifications. I'm now currently vetting all of that information, preparing information for the board around those topics. And if I may, Delegate Feldmark, I think it's most important to talk about the first one, which is the removal of SROs and the work of which we're looking at. And I define that as a three-pronged process, delegation members. One is our Board of Education has already taken action with their budget by allocating $2.2 million in the first prong to provide mental health supports. We hope that we continue to advocate, and that will move through the process, and we'll have funding to have the money to $2.2 million to provide an additional 22 FTEs to our school system around the alternative education teachers and the mental health therapists. Our Board of Education has already acted on that and have included that in their budget. That's prong one. Prong two is then the recommendation that I've made all along in this discussion is, if we remove SROs, as a former high school principal and an assistant principal at the middle school level and an elementary principal, we have to manage our schools and keep our schools safe. So if it's a repeal and replace, I can't just let that to chance. I'm advocating that if we remove SROs, if that's the proposal that goes, the mental health supports are there, and then the need for the security assistance needs to be there as well. And the distinction with the security assistance is they have no arrest powers, they have no guns, and they report to the superintendent. Chief and I've had this discussion that the distinction with SROs is that they have arrest powers, they have guns, and they report to the chief of police. As she's very clearly said, that funding rests with the chief of police. So those security assistants, and we already have 18 of those in the school system. We already have 18. I would broaden that and add additional complements to provide that. That's prong two. The third prong, I think the delegation clearly understands that I've articulated the last meeting that we had, was the Safe to Learn Act is still out there, and it's something that I have to comply with. It is the law. And it says, it doesn't say SROs have to be provided, but we have to have adequate law enforcement coverage. And 77% of the schools in the state of Maryland have SROs, do not have SROs, and they're able to provide that level of compliance. So how do we fill that need with the Safe to Learn Act? Would be a cooperative conversation with the chief of police, which would be something like a community resource officer, individuals who would provide that support to schools, not necessarily based in the school every day, but that's making the assumption if we remove SROs. So I've clearly defined those three prongs that I view as non-negotiables if we remove SROs. And the Board of Education has that decision in front of them for April 29th. And I recommended that we waited till sine die to see what kind of additional legislation would move through the state, because there's a number of different bills that have been under consideration, and my board wants to have the very best information in front of them. But what I want to impress upon the delegation is, provide me with the tools to keep our kids safe. That is my top priority, and I can't allow anything that's going to thwart our efforts to provide that safety necessary. And there's several different theories of thought. You know, do some individuals advocate for SROs, others do not. But we're moving through that process, and the tenets contained in this amendment address some of the prongs of which I talked about that would allow the level of compliance with the Safe to Learn Act, the insertion of mental health supports, as well as then the security assistance. And I've also worked with our administrators in providing them with the opportunity to give me feedback on that. And they're very much, they really have enjoyed their relationship with SROs, but also know that there is also other models that we're looking at as well that I've just defined in terms of those two options. So for the sake of brevity, Delegate Feldmark, I've got a lot I could talk about on this topic, but I'll end there, recognizing your need for time. Thank you.
Thank you. And I do think that we will need some additional conversation with the sponsor of the amendment and the sponsor of the bill. And I thank you for your willingness to join in that. I believe the sponsor of the amendment had a very quick comment to share.
Yes, ma'am. So there has been a certain amount of impugnment of this amendment, and that's because we had to work on the fly a bit. I do thank Senator Gazzoni and Delegate Atterbury for helping me to craft this. Clearly, it would need some work, and since we're coming back next week, everyone is saying we need to sit down and talk. I do commend Dr. Martirano and the school system for reaching out to me and talking to me about this and actually making a few suggestions. I think that I see Maureen Evans-Arthur. She will confirm that we struggled very hard to find a good meeting time with the police on this, and we just weren't successful. But the idea of sitting down and getting some of this ironed out, if we are indeed going to discuss it, is something that I encourage, and I am waiting for people to help me get those appointments done. I will reach out as well. Thank you. Less than 60.
Okay, thank you. Folks, we were not originally scheduled to meet next week, so we've got to regroup, so stay tuned on timing. But with that, for now, we are adjourned. Thank you.